So yeah, so thanks Jörg for kind of organizing this chat. I mean, we've talked before about our kind of perspectives on photography and other things. So it's really nice to be able to pick up some of those threads. And obviously also congratulations on the book. I thought maybe to begin with, it'd be useful on the basis that probably a lot of people listening to this won't have had a chance to read the book yet, for you to slightly kind of summarize, or for us to slightly kind of summarize the main argument. So, I mean, I've read it, and I mean, I suppose very briefly, the argument is, and feel free to correct me on this, that kind of there's a certain type of photography that fulfills a function in neoliberal capitalist societies like the ones that we live in, which is very similar to the kind of role that socialist realist art played in the Soviet Union. And so for anyone who doesn't know socialist realist art, which I don't imagine as many people, it's that art typified by quite kind of campy, often quite campy paintings of kind of idealized workers, you know, images of Stalin looking very kind of beautiful and so on. And so the kind of argument seems to be that it acts as this kind of propaganda in the same way socialist realist artwork did. That's there to kind of, and it's there to kind of legitimize and kind of perpetuate the status quo in these kind of capitalist societies. Is that a kind of accurate summing up? And can you say a bit more about this and expand?
Yes, it is quite accurate. The comparison with the Soviet Union, of course, will strike. I'm assuming many people as very strange because we live in a free society, and the Soviet Union was not a free society. But one thing you said goes actually at the heart of why I was interested in this. You said that these socialist realist paintings look camp, and they do. They mostly do because they rely on an ideology and a background that's vastly different than what we are used to. So we can see the artifice in them, and we can question them, and we are sort of made to think about what's going on because they look so weird. But so the main point of my book is that this kind of mechanism actually does exist in our society as well, and neoliberal realism is just one example. So my main point actually is that because we are so used to the assumptions and the ideologies that we govern and that we live in, we can't easily detect art or photography that is made to operate in very similar ways to socialist realism. And so I was actually quite surprised when I started looking into Annie Leibovitz, how when I attempted to read it, it just was so striking how similar it was and acted to socialist realism. This is not something I didn't set out to do this. I didn't set out to prove like, okay, this is socialist realism. Do we have this? It sort of came the other way around. And I think that's really important, not just in this particular case of neoliberal realism, but in general to sort of question images, what they show and how they show it, and what it might say about assumptions that we actually have that we never really think about and that we never really question ourselves.
I mean, it is really it's something that I've always felt was very interesting, that this kind of such stilted art could originate out of a country that just kind of a decade before had this incredible kind of vibrant avant-garde, you know, film, photography, painting. And I mean, even more to the extent that, you know, there were a relatively small number of artists like this, but there were a number of artists who went from doing one to doing the other for various reasons, some of them for ideology, some of them because it was the only way to kind of survive. So
Yeah.
I think it is a very interesting kind of comparison. I guess maybe you could extend it and find examples of people who actually, perhaps in our society, have almost quite a schizophrenic existence, where they produce stuff you could see as neoliberal realism, and then actually maybe at the same time also produce stuff that you could see as more kind of admirable art. But maybe we'll come back to that. I mean, that's a good moment maybe to then lead to the next question I want to ask, which is about the photographers you've chosen as kind of case studies in the book. So just to very briefly summarize, I mean, they're three very different, or superficially, I would say, very different photographers. Annie Leibovitz, as you've mentioned, who's kind of best known for her kind of particular brand of kind of studio fashion photographs, mostly of celebrities. Gregory Crewdson, who does these kind of very meticulous staged kind of tableau style photographs. He's kind of, I've placed him in a kind of pictorial wing of art photography. And then Andres Gursky, who's kind of harder in a way to position, partly because he's shifted around over time. But I think very loosely, I would push them into kind of a conceptual corner. I don't know, you don't have to agree with those categories, but that's just my attempt to kind of summarize them. I mean, could you say a bit more then about why you felt these were an interesting kind of trio to look at as examples of this?
Sure. It really all started with Annie Leibovitz. I received the book in the mail, and I mean, of course, I knew of her work, and I had my ideas about the work, and I always thought, why would I be looking at this, and why are they even sending me this book? So I was a little, I don't want to say offended, but in a minor sense. And then I thought, why don't I just look at this and see what it's actually doing? So I leafed through the book, and I realized some things. This heroism, everybody's a hero in those pictures. So that had me think about the history of photography. So I started thinking a little bit about, like, let's say, Leni Riefenstahl. You could think about Hollywood film stills from the 1930s, where this sort of visual heroism is very prevalent. And then I thought, okay, so what is this in service of? Like, why would these people be depicted in that way? And why is the artifice itself? The pictures are very artificial. The colors are sort of wonky. Nobody ever looks like they would look like in real life. The skin tones are all over the place, as they are here in the Zoom call as well. So I was wondering, like, wait, if that's not the key, like, it is not realistic, what is this actually going for? What is this aiming at? And I had read this book by Boris Groys about socialist realism and socialist art in the Soviet Union. And this connection sort of established itself, that these people are depicted in these heroic poses because they are to be admired. They are the winners in some way. They are successful, they are powerful. And I just try to draw the parallel between socialist realism and, okay, what would if this is happening in a capitalist society, what is this actually going for? And very clearly, the idea of capitalism is based on success, on succeeding. You're a successful business person. This idea has changed and become more amplified over my lifetime. I remember I grew up in West Germany, which at the time was a very social democratic country with strong labor unions. I think the same existed in the UK. And then in the UK and the US, everything shifted very rapidly in the 1980s. In Germany, it took a little longer to shift. So this idea of the neoliberal capitalism that we live under now is not what I was used to growing up. So I know there are different ways, different models of capitalism. And the idea of the winners and losers. Nobody calls them losers, but the people that are successful, they're being celebrated, whether they're billionaires making a lot of money, successful entrepreneurs, and they get away with a lot of stuff. But they're being depicted by Annie Leibovitz in these heroic poses. So clearly there is an element of celebration going on. And then once I was at that stage, I thought, okay, well, if this is really correct, then if they're winners, then are the losers being shown? Is there photography that focuses on what happens when you don't fulfill your role in the system that we live in? And I don't know how this actually happened, but at some stage, the name Gregory Crutzen popped up in my head, and I thought about his depiction of people going about their lives. So actually, they're not really going about anything. They're always just completely despondent, sitting there or standing there or, barely interacting with each other. So this is how this polarity between Annie Leibovitz and Gregory Crutzen came up. And this is not to say that those two artists are the only artists working in that thing. I'm just using it as examples. So then when Michael Mack approached me to write the book and to expand what I had originally written into a longer piece, I had already a draft for a longer piece on my computer because I wanted to extend this idea and really work this out. And at that time, when I started expanding it, I had previously written also about the idea of the sublime, capitalist sublime. And I'd written about a photographer who had photographed in Dubai. You have seen the pictures, you go to Dubai or any of these rich Arab countries, and there are all these grandiose buildings, and photographers go with large format cameras and make these imposing, grandiose pictures. And the main model for that kind of work, I thought, would be Andreas Gursky. He has brought a set of artifice also to his work, which is interesting. So a lot of these photographers, the ones I picked, rely on this artifice of splicing things together and constructing a reality that's even more how do I say it, grandiose than the actual reality they're depicting, as if they had to amplify everything. So that's how these three actually came to be the focus of the book. And I wanted to add Gursky in part also because this idea of the sublime art, historically, of course, the sublime is an interesting thing to think about. And it lends itself, the sublime lends itself, I think, to supporting this idea of neoliberal realism. It's like creating this grandiose world where the individual really has no role. It's just this minion. But if you work hard enough, then you can be intensely successful and you can be a billionaire as well.
I mean, it's interesting, that idea of splicing, because actually I've often thought that one of the possible precursors to socialist realism was actually some of that constructivist montage where, you know, you have these amazing images of figures like Stalin looming over these kind of parades of tanks and soldiers and aeroplanes. And I mean, they're obviously constructivist. They're not socialist realist in the way that we kind of understand it now. But then you can see this continuation in the sense that a lot of socialist realist painting, at the same time as being realist in quite a, again, campy sense, you know, in quite a kind of, like, it's kind of quite weak pictorial painting, it also has this non-realism in the sense that scale, for example, is quite often kind of thrown out of the window.
That's right.
And I mean, again, I think that kind of leads slightly into the next question. I'm gonna actually kind of slightly merge the next two questions, because
Okay,
actually
can I say one
yeah,
thing? Because I
yeah,
think
yeah.
really, what you said about the constructivism is really true. If you look, a lot of constructivist art is propaganda, or was designed to be propaganda. In Greuss's book, he actually spells out the fight over what art had to look like to support ideology. And one of the, I mean, I'm really simplifying this quite a bit, but Stalin just didn't like constructivist art. Just like, you know, Hitler they didn't get art that wasn't beautiful in sort of like a campy or like a very obvious way. So that's why I think this connection is really apt. Also, a lot of constructivist artists originally were supporters of communism, not the Stalinist kind, but, you know, Leninist and this idea of socialism. So that it's not a complete rupture to what they were doing, even though, of course, photographers didn't. I mean, there were no socialist realist photographers. I think. I mean, photographers had to adapt to, you know, what they were doing, and graphic artists, painters, and everybody, you know, they changed to the socialist realism. But I think that comparison is really apt and really interesting, like, because that's one of the reasons why I started looking into this in the first place. I was aware of constructivist art. I was a big, you know, I'm mesmerized by the art, and I just couldn't understand how do they make this jump from something that looks visually is a form of propaganda, but it's visually very interesting, to this like really campy, stupid crap. Like, why did this even happen? And that's why I started looking into this and I read this book to understand, like, wait, what was going on and what were those fights? But anyway, so sorry to.
No, I think I agree. It's super interesting. And I mean, I think to me, what's very interesting again are the people who managed to kind of survive to some extent within that system. And I kind of think of someone like Sergei Eisenstein, for example, who, you know, when you look at his films of the 20s and 30s, I think it'd be fair to describe them as constructivist in the sense they used a lot of the kind of same ideas about media and about kind of the way things could be kind of combined. But then obviously his career continued through the kind of socialist realist stage. Admittedly, his filmmaking changed quite a lot and in some ways became, I suppose, more kind of obviously socialist realist. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing, the different decisions artists made either to compromise with that system, to try and work within it, to compromise because they agreed ideologically, or in some cases to completely kind of withdraw from it. And I guess someone like Alexander Rodchenchenko is maybe an interesting example of that, in the sense he was kind of hauled up, I know, for producing work that didn't really fit with the tenets of socialist realism. But I mean, I think, yeah, no, I mean, it's a really interesting segue into the next thing, which I was going to ask you. And like I said, I'm going to kind of merge slightly two questions because I feel looking at them now, they're quite connected. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting looking at the three artists you've chosen, we've kind of touched on this a bit already, is that they're, to me at least, they all have distinctly kind of anti-realist qualities in their work. I mean, Leibovitz's work is obviously very studio-based. You know, Crewdson's, by its own kind of admission, is all about setting up and kind of creating a kind of tableau. And Gursky's admittedly varies a lot across his career, but I mean, I think the thing he's known to a lot of people for are his kind of manipulated images, like the image of the Rhine that was the kind of most expensive photograph for a while. And I guess what that suggests to me, I mean, that makes me think back to these kind of Cold War battles over art. And one of the things I've always found interesting is that abstract expressionism was kind of positioned during the Cold War as a counterpart, as an opponent to Soviet socialist realism. And the thinking, as I've understood it, behind that was that abstract expressionism was so individualistic compared to socialist realism that was so kind of monolithic and so about a kind of single state-defined look, that it was seen by its kind of promoters in the US, which allegedly include the CIA, who supposedly funded abstract expressionist artwork, as a kind of an exemplar of, you know, actually in the United States, we're so free that we even allow this kind of incomprehensible artwork to be made. And I guess what this is all leading to, my kind of question here is, I mean, do you see in the kind of very contrived qualities of this neoliberal realism, do you feel that says something specific about neoliberalism? I mean, you know, is it again a kind of, does it say something about its kind of artificiality, for example?
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think, I mean, the one thing that I stress in the book is that the contrived nature of the work is kind of beside the point. This is not to, you know, dismiss your question at all, because, you know, if you just look at that, then you just look at like heavily manipulated photographs, and why would you look at them? But it's sort of what they're getting at. That's the interesting part. So if you focus on just like, okay, this is not a straight photograph, like this is a discussion we could have in a photo school, or like a documentary photographer would say, these are not photographs. You know, so, but that's kind of beside the point, I think, for when you really want to get at the message. But I like this idea that there's something so contrived about them that it actually reflects back to neoliberal capitalism. Because I think, I mean, of course, we live in a free society. Now, to what extent it actually is free is you know, we can argue about, and that's a politics question. But there is something that's artificial about the system that we live in, and there is something. I mean, the neoliberalism is contested, heavily contested. I live in the United States, and you know, the discussion now is, you know, the Bernie Sanders crowd. They talk about socialism, but what they really mean is like a social democratic system, not a socialist system. So they're trying to convince people that, you know, having things such as universal health care and you know, unions is actually a good thing. And the opponents of that, the Republicans, they basically say, well, you know, this is not free. You know, if we want to have a free country, then we have to have unfettered capitalism. And the idea is unfettered capitalism and neoliberal capitalism will benefit everybody, because, you know, this is an old idea. There's this trickle down economy, you know, so or another way that's often used is like a rising tide will lift all boats. Now, the actual reality is that doesn't happen. You know, under the COVID pandemic, the top billionaires made a lot of money, and if you look at how everybody else was doing, that was not so great. So the actual lived reality of people is very different than what's being claimed about what the system would actually produce. So there's a conflict here, and this conflict is part of the reason why the system actually needs a form of propaganda. The propaganda can be political, or it can be with words. You know, when you create these ideas, or rising tide lifts all boats, that's kind of a form of propaganda, right? Or it can be visual, to convey the idea that, you know, the system is really good because, you know, look at these winners, and you can be one of the winners. And if you don't want to be one of the winners, then, you know, look at what happens, you know, if you're one of the losers. I don't know if this answered your question, but I think there is something really contrived about this idea of the rising tide, because we all know, I think we all know that it actually is not true.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's also a very interesting parallel between kind of Soviet communism, if you even call it that, because again, as you say, these terms are very contestable. and neoliberalism, in the sense that at least the history I've read of the Soviet Union gives you a sense that it was egalitarian when it was kind of convenient, and then not egalitarian the rest of the time. So, I mean, as an example, I think Svetlana Alexeyevich's book about the unwomanly face of war, which is about the role of women in the Second World War, where they were fighting in all the same frontline roles as men, is a kind of amazing example of that, because you have women who fought all the way through the war, you know, because it was convenient for the state at that point. They would take anyone who could handle a gun. And then at the end of the war, we're basically told not to talk about it, because then it became inconvenient, and, you know, the state reverted to a very un-egalitarian form. And I think, as you say, you can see a similar kind of inconsistency, I guess, in neoliberal states. And I mean, one thing I see a lot in the UK is that the same people who talk about the importance of free markets don't seem to recognize that they're often actually perpetuating very unfree markets, for example, by emphasizing the importance of, you know, for example, the arms industry, which in the UK tends to be very kind of protectively kind of over subsidized by the government. And I imagine in the US, probably it's fairly similar dynamic. So it's this kind of opportunistic, yeah, it's a free market, you know, if you're not getting ahead, then that's your fault, up to a certain point where then it's like, oh, actually our friends at X arms company, they're going to go under if they don't get a government arms deal in the next kind of 6 months. And then suddenly, you know, so that's a bit of a simplification, but I mean, I totally kind of hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, in all fairness, if I want to add one thing. In all fairness, I think any political or economical system needs a form of propaganda. I mean, I wasn't that old in the 1970s. I was growing up, but I do distinctly remember that there was a form of propaganda created by, and it still exists in some form, in Germany, about this idea of the social market economy, which was a social democratic system where there would be strong labor unions, there would be universal health care. You know, that had been around since the 1800s in Germany. But there was propaganda created to justify that, like, restricting the freedom of the market actually benefited everybody. So I'm not trying to criticize neoliberal capitalism per se. I mean, that's, you know, I'm just a photo critic, right? I write about photography, but it is, I think, very important to realize that any free society relies to some extent on propaganda, on a way of like self-affirmation, maybe, to sort of support what it is doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mulled over discussing with you when I was pondering what to talk about. I mean, I think, you know, one of the, as well as taking apart words like neoliberal and kind of socialist and communist, you know, propaganda is potentially quite an important word to take apart, because it's used massively today, and I guess has been since it really re-entered widespread use in the early 20th century as a kind of pejorative term. But I mean, of course, its original usage wasn't pejorative.
Right.
It was, you know, it was pretty descriptive, really. That it was, I mean, as you I'm sure know, its origins in the Catholic Church as a term for kind of the propagation of the faith. And I mean, actually, I've had conversations before about my work where I've said I don't really have a problem with my work being seen as propaganda. I'd rather people are conscious of the aim of it, the kind of political aim of it, than imagine that it's some kind of neutral expression of information, which I don't see it as at all. So I mean, I think, again, that's a really interesting term to, you know, we're talking about in a minute probably about kind of normative assumptions and kind of things that people don't scrutinize. I think that word, again, is an interesting one to scrutinize.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, so I think you know, one of the things you talk about a bit in this text, this kind of idea that these photographs kind of embody these societal beliefs that are very fundamental, that we often don't really, again, take time to pull apart and think about, like this idea of winners and losers. It might not be expressed as such, but there's definitely a sense, I think, in societies, certainly like mine, that people do fall into these categories. And, you know, if you haven't striven enough, and in fact, I think there was a use of the terms strivers and skivers in the UK by a politician a few years ago, but that is kind of down to you, that isn't the product of some kind of bigger structural force. And I mean, it's interesting to be talking to you about this now, because during lockdown I was writing about this same idea, but in relation to photography specifically. Like, I think a lot of photographers carry with them these same kind of like normative beliefs, social scientists might call them, you know, which are these beliefs that just are kind of invisible to us. We don't think about them, but they shape our kind of, they shape our actions, you know, every day. And so I guess where I'm going with this is, you know, if these photographs do kind of embody these kind of normative beliefs, I suppose, do they do that to a greater extent than other photographs? I'm guessing I know the answer to this, but I'd still like it, you just answer that. And also, you know, I mean, actually, how much can we stand outside these beliefs, you know, even if we're conscious of them? Because I mean, one of the things I was writing about was that even as photographers, if we're very conscious of the history of our medium and the things that have fed into it and influenced our thinking about it, you know, it's actually still really hard not to be influenced by those things, even when you can kind of see them.
Yeah, of course. I really like that term, this normative beliefs or normative assumptions, and I think we all have that, and that's just a human thing. I don't see that as the problem. The problem is when you pretend you either don't have it, or when you don't want to acknowledge it and then try to have your work do something that actually runs counter to these normative beliefs. And that's, I mean, we could, I don't know, I would be curious to hear your examples and about this. You know, the history of photography is filled with photographers pretending to do one thing when they in reality doing exactly something else.
Very much so, yeah.
I think, you know, I'm really interested in photography because you can do so many things with photographs and they can fulfill so many functions, and they're so malleable. They're actually more malleable in a way than a lot of photographers want to believe. For example, I also think that, you know, you could easily interpret the work by Gursky or Leibowitz or Kreutz in a completely different way. I'm not saying this is the one way to interpret them. You know, you put them in different contexts and it might become something very different. But I think it's very, very important for any photographer to know, to be fully aware of, like, what are the assumptions that I'm putting in this work. Even like, what are my assumptions about what photographs can do, what photographs are, what is my role as a photographer? Because that shapes to a large extent how you engage with the medium and how you shape your work. I don't know, maybe you can talk, this would be really interesting for me to hear how you approach this, because I think, as you said, you wrote about it and you've thought about it quite a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we'll come back to that idea of interpretation because I think it's a really interesting thing again that comes out of your writing. But I mean, well, just to use one very obvious example that I was writing about, you know, I mean, the kind of invention of photography partly emerges out of this culture that predicates or prioritizes kind of seeing amongst all the other senses, that sees, because of the history of kind of the emergence of kind of practices like scientific method and empiricism, you know, sees sight and observation of phenomena as like the key to understanding them. And I think that thinking obviously fed into photography in the way it was developed and used. And I think it's still reflected in the way that a lot of photographers use the camera, which is they think, they go and take a picture of something. And I think this again comes back to your writing and your reference, for example, to Brecht's kind of famous quote about the AEG factory or the Krupp steelworks. If I show a picture of this, it explains it. And I think, you know, as we're probably both very conscious, that is almost most of the time not true, and in a very rare number of circumstances actually true. You know, it's very hard, I think, in a photograph to show a sense of causality or why something is the way it is. So, you know, I mean, I wrote about a whole series of these things. I think the piece is up in a few days or weeks. So, but I mean, I just think it's very interesting to kind of dig into these things. And I think I felt that it was particularly visible the way these normative beliefs were kind of manifesting in the way coronavirus was photographed.
Yeah.
You know, again, in the sense that these tropes that we saw a lot of that were emerging, to me, seemed very much to speak to these kind of assumptions about how we should use photography.
Right.
And I mean, just
Oh, go ahead.
well, just to say one final thing. I mean, I think one thing that's important to distinguish with this is this isn't to do with the specific qualities of photography as a mechanism either. You know, what's really interesting to me about these behaviors is sometimes, to me, they actually run directly counter to the logical way, at least to me, to use photography as a medium. So, yeah, sorry, you were going to say.
I mean, I think one of the reasons why all of this is very important to me is not just, I mean, I think neoliberal capitalism completely out of balance has created a large number of problems, and they're not just only economical. I speak in the text, I speak about race, for example, and the idea that capitalism inherently is racist. And if you look at the history of photography, there still are a lot of normative assumptions that tie to parts of the medium that are incredibly problematic for a variety of reasons. I mean, here we are two Western men talking about photography, and we operate in a tradition. Photography was used throughout its history for colonial purposes, for all kinds of purposes, and it's, from what I've found, is it's again, I noticed how it's easy to see the camp in socialist realism. From what I learned, is it's very easy for people in India or in Japan or in parts of Africa to see the exploitation of the Western gaze and the work that we just take for granted, that we don't see that. So my essay is also an invitation for that reason to really look deeply into what photography is and what it does, because some assumptions that we put into pictures, whether they are concerned the male gaze or street photography or whatever there is, or colonial photography, depictions of certain groups of people, the relevance of those questions is just vastly increased once we leave this bubble that we're in. I mean, I'm just talking about the two of us, right? The question of race, how are people being depicted? I talk about that to some extent in the essay with an example of Annie Leibovitz, who found herself in hot waters over a cover of an African-American athlete whose skin tone was just completely absurd, right? So why is that an issue? Why should we be aware of that? So there's a lot, I think the way I see this essay, it's very specific about neoliberal capitalism and the role photography plays, but you could use the same approach and talk about a lot of other issues that are very important right now.
So yeah, so I think that's a really good moment to kind of turn to this idea of kind of the meaning of these images and images in general. And particularly, I think one of the things you touched on in the text is this kind of idea that actually it's quite interesting to look at photographs, not necessarily for what they actually achieve in the world or how people actually receive them, because I mean, clearly with the images here, some of them are very contested, particularly Leibovitz's, which in some cases have sparked a lot of controversy. But actually, that's interesting to look at the way the makers have tried to encode certain messages into them, either maybe consciously or unconsciously. So could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I actually don't know to what extent how conscious these three artists are about the way I read the images. I'm pretty sure they create images. I mean, the images are much too specific for them not to be made with a certain intent. I'm just taking the liberty to sort of, I mean, I have no access to that intent in the first place. And I also take the liberty of decoding them in a different way. But I think this idea of encoding a message, I mean, it comes back to these normative assumptions. The normative assumptions that you mentioned guide the way we make images. So in that sense, the normative assumptions are encoded in photographs, and I think that can be decoded. I wouldn't necessarily call these assumptions sort of like a message, because there's no message, I think, other than maybe an affirmation of the normative assumptions, calling to be affirming themselves, right? This idea of like neoliberal capitalism, there's winners and losers, you want to be one of the winners. So, you present people that way. And then this neoliberal capitalism is this gigantic force that you have no control over, right? It's sort of like, these are like these three legs that everything stands on. That's why there's these three artists, right? Gursky is basically showing us this, free system that's not controlled by any single person, still acts as this monolith that needs to ensure that we are not questioning it or not challenging it. Did that answer your question, or am I missing?
Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing also about Gursky's work is, in a way, because his work most directly, as you say, addresses neoliberalism itself. In a way, that's to me the kind of ultimate trick or the ultimate show of power, is that you can actually say, hey, look at this thing. you know, you can pull back the curtains at times and say, hey, look at how awful this thing is, but you can't do anything about it
Yeah,
except
so
buy this photograph.
that's the interesting part of photography, right? Even when you go and you photograph these things and your intention is completely critical, the photographs subvert what you're trying to do. I mean, I know even if Gursky is trying to be critical of the stock market, I don't think he actually is, but you know, even if he is, by showing us this thing, the criticism falls completely flat. And it's interesting, one thing I find interesting about Gursky is he went to all these different locations I forgot it was like in Abu Dhabi or any of these Emirates. And he actually decided, instead of just photographing these completely artificial islands and all these things that were made in the desert that are already insane itself, right? Why would you build a racetrack in the middle of the desert? He decided to even further the artifice by changing them pictorially and to sort of add on top of what people had already done. And you can say, well, this is just working with photographs, and I can see where that fits in with the Düsseldorf tradition. But in another sense, it's completely supportive of what's actually going on. So he's actually furthering the ideology behind it. It's like, oh, you know, we are shaping the world. And if you have enough money, then you can shape the world. But if you're an artist, then you can continue shaping it, right?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, which we won't maybe get into because I don't want to kind of run over time. But I mean, about the extent to which artists kind of say, oh, you know, this has nothing to do with me, I just take the pictures. And I mean, there's another photographer who's a very acclaimed kind of landscape photographer whose name also begins with a Y, but I won't name him. And I've always found his work really difficult to gauge because I've always felt his work could just as comfortably be on a Greenpeace advert or on the kind of boardroom wall of a kind of oil company, or, you know, a company that's kind of dumping toxic waste in the ocean. You know, it's very hard to read the work and know where it sits along that kind of continuum. But maybe we can move on just to kind of final couple of questions. I mean, one of the things you also touched on in passing in the text is this kind of thing that's, I'm not wary of even using the term in quote marks, but kind of cancel culture, particularly in reference to James Franco, who's photographed for a Vogue cover by Annie Leibovitz and then kind of disappeared because of accusations that have been made against him. And I mean, you make this kind of connection between that and the disappearance of kind of political enemies under Stalin from photographs and kind of books and so on. And I mean, I think it's really interesting because, I mean, to me, when people kind of get very angry about this idea of cancel culture, to me, actually, what's interesting about it is I see it as the product of a very kind of neoliberal marketplace. Again, a marketplace in personalities. And to me, I mean, the celebrity marketplace is one where people do or say things that, you know, people enjoy or like or admire, and so they acquire this kind of celebrity status and they rise up and they become more and more prominent. And to me, that's a marketplace essentially in a very traditional neoliberal sense, right? It's obviously more complex than that and not quite so neoliberal and free of the kind of manipulation as people might like to think. But to me, I mean, cancel culture is kind of the same process in reverse, which is that, you know, when these people do things that we don't like, they lose their the kind of demand for them in the marketplace disappears. Because I mean, you know, very few people I think would like to say that they have a poster of someone who's for example, a racist or, you know, kind of sex pest on their bedroom wall. I mean, you know, we lose interest in these people based on, you know, their behaviors. So I mean, I think it's interesting because if you think of maybe the erasure of political enemies as very kind of Soviet authoritarianism, to me cancel culture in a way also is a very apt reflection of the society that's given rise to it. I wonder if you have any kind of more thoughts about this, because you pass over the subject quite quickly in the text, but I kind of felt reading it that there was maybe more here.
Yeah, so the Franco removal happened before this term cancel culture actually came into being, and I actually didn't think about it that way. I mean, there are a lot of aspects to cancel culture that are really interesting. We could talk about that for an hour, but the reason why I talk about this only briefly was because I saw this. I mean, it is, you could say, okay, he was canceled, right? James Franco was canceled. There would probably be somebody who would be willing to make that case. right? This is just canceling, you know, how could this be right, blah, 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 blah. And I could see the point of that. But what was interesting for me was like the fact that they would actually, the magazine or the photographer working for the magazine actually sort of adjusted the photograph that is in support of this ideology according to this recent development that just happened. I think that sort of pulled back the curtain a little bit to the artifice that's being presented, and it sort of reveals this idea that what you really get to see is not a realization, like a realistic depiction of a Hollywood industry. Right? If you wanted to have a realistic depiction of that industry, then you probably should include James Franco, because, you know, or you know, it's part of that culture. It doesn't mean that I like it, but if you just pretend it doesn't exist, then you're basically sort of making something go away that should be talked about. And that shows, I think, if you make it just go away, it shows that what you're really interested in is not to depict a group of people. It is to sort of prop up an ideology and to create a celebration for something that's actually in reality much too complicated and maybe partly flawed to be celebrated wholesale. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's, again, a really good, I think it's one of the few to me at least, legitimate criticisms, if we use this word cancel culture, that actually this kind of dropping of figures by organizations actually has very little often to do with social justice, and a lot to do with the fact that they've become a distraction from what they're actually about, which is, you know, again, in a neoliberal society, usually making money. So, and I think you could kind of extend that to say they've also become a distraction, yeah, from the kind of project of perpetuating a certain idea about the society that we live in. So yeah, it does absolutely answer my question.
I mean, and there are some cases, I don't remember the names or the details, but there are some cases where people lost their jobs because people misunderstood what they were tweeting, and then, you know, the company basically automatically wanted to sever the ties with their employees. You know, that's very neoliberal thinking. You know, somebody tweeted, I think, about an article that was very critical of something, and somebody misconstrued that, and there was a whole uproar. And, you know, and those examples are always brought up as, you know, this is why cancel culture is bad. I think most of the discussions about cancel culture are just using those examples to hide an inconvenient truth that's actually happening somewhere else. Because oftentimes the term cancel culture is used and brought up by exactly those powerful people that don't want to face the reckoning that maybe on social media might be happening.
Absolutely.
In the United States, certain US senators from the Republican Party talk about this all the time when they're being confronted with something they said. It's like, oh yeah, I'm being canceled right now. No, you're not. You're just being challenged by people about what you just said.
I mean, I think it's interesting, without getting into the kind of photo land politics of this, because there've been a few recent kind of, well, I suppose, debates around this, and a few recent examples where people or their defenders have said, oh, this person is being cancelled. And I think, as you say, I mean, one of the issues is quite often, from my perspective, that the photography organizations that are kind of doing the cancelling, if you like, quite often are doing it because actually they don't want to have to scrutinize their part over the years in promoting and defending these figures, and actually in many cases allowing them to do the things that people are now, you know, getting rightly angry about. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great great kind of answer. So I mean, I guess last question really, I mean, you know, I mean, I think inevitably, you know, talking about this idea of neoliberal realism, you know, inevitably kind of Mark Fisher's writing kind of came to mind. And, you know, he about just over 10 years ago, I think now, wrote about this idea of capitalist realism, which is a bit of a different idea, but I mean has kind of connections. And I mean his kind of idea was it's quite complex and difficult to summarize, but it's often summed up quite well, I think, with this quote from him that you know, it's kind of easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, i.e. kind of capitalism's inserted itself as the only viable reality for most of us, which I think, you know, you can see clear continuations there from things like, you know, people like Francis Fukuyama, who was obviously a massive influence on the emergence of neoliberalism, who you know, made this, again, much more complex argument than I'm going to make it sound here, but made this kind of argument that, you know, we'd reached the end of history, and that kind of capitalism, liberal democratic capitalism, was now going to be the only state, you know, it's going to be the status quo now. I guess where I'm going with this is what I think is so interesting about your work being published now is that, you know, only 10 years on from Fisher's work, I think, to me, without wanting to be overly optimistic or suggest that kind of neoliberalism's kind of creaking at the knees or about to kind of dissolve, because I don't at all believe that. I think it feels in some ways more tenuous than it maybe did 10 years ago, and certainly than it did 30 years ago when Fukuyama's kind of essay was written at the end of the Cold War. So I guess my question here is, you know, does the use of this kind of propaganda suggest that actually neoliberalism is kind of vulnerable? Does it need things like, you know, mass media culture to perpetuate itself, because it's actually kind of increasingly vulnerable to the kind of criticisms and the kind of analysis that we've been talking about for the last hour?
I think most ideologies need a form of propaganda to sustain themselves. I think all of them probably. I mean, I'm not a sociologist or anthropologist to, you know, speak of with any kind of competence about this. So in that sense, neoliberalism is not that different than the social democratic model that existed in Britain and in Germany in the 1970s. But I think the system has become more vulnerable because people are realizing, wait, this is actually not working out. Now with the pandemic, especially in the United States, I think the Chicago School of Economists, they were sort of driving this whole idea, as far as I know. And so now there is, you know, the idea of like socialism in the US, the social democratic movement. And I think people are realizing that the system just isn't working enough for society as a whole. And it's caused, you know, the rise of populism. You can make that connection. And I think maybe the sheer camp of, you know, I mean, let's be honest, these photographers make work that you could describe as camp, right? Not all of it, but some of it for sure. I think the sheer camp points out that, you know, how fragile that system that they're supporting actually is. Now, whether or not that's really going to change, I don't know, but I've seen it change in my lifetime. So there's no reason to believe that at some stage people couldn't realize, wait, this is not working. You know, we need to have antitrust against Google. It's just started, you know, these companies, these massive corporations, we need to rein in tax evasion and all these kinds of tax havens. It's possible that could happen. But I think the artificiality of the idea, you know, the rising tide lifts all boats, it's just not happening. And the inequality created through the system, inequality that also is, you know, plays out differently, whether you're white or black or brown. People, you know, I don't think are just willing to accept that any longer. Let's say more people are willing to say, no, this doesn't work. And we see this in part playing out in the US election right now. So I do think, even though I wouldn't want to go so far and say that, you know, because, you know, photographs only do certain things. And at the end of the day, they're just photographs. I don't think capitalist realist photographs say too much about the system, but I do think that they contain the problem of the system, you know, that it's sort of more wobbly than, you know, we'd want to believe.
Brilliant. Well, thanks again very much, Jörg, for taking the time to talk, and congratulations again on the book.
No, thank you so much for, you know, your questions and for the discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.